We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. We'll be getting started in just a few more minutes. Just going to start the recording. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for day 3 of our digital literacy training. My name is Danielle Blunt. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with Hacking Hustling, which is a collective of sex workers and accomplices working at the intersection of tech and social justice to interrupt state surveillance and violence that's facilitated by technology. Just a few housekeeping notes. You can turn the captioning on if you want it. On the bottom right of the screen, you might have to click on the ... for more. And I'll type that into the chat as well in a second. Questions can go into the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to check the live stream Q&A as well. I wanted to share a few values and shared agreements and intentions. We believe that sex work is a valid form of labor, that our vulnerabilities are the result of the socio-cultural approach to transactional sex. We believe in decriminalization, decarceration, and divestment from state violence. We believe that access to more opportunities, not less, is a path of harm reduction and safety. We believe that sex workers who use internet platforms are one part of a larger world of people who engage in commercial sex, and we value all forms of transactional sex. And Olivia and Ingrid, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi, everyone. My name's Olivia. My pronouns are she, her. And just wanted to say that this workshop will be centered in thinking of cyber defense rather than like military technology, really thinking of cyber defense and cryptography as an abolitionist technology and thinking of it as an expression of mutual care and accountability in a way of accumulating community-based power. And through that, really grounding ourselves in teaching in a way that's anti-racist, anti-binary, and pro-femme, and also trauma-informed. So teaching from a place of gentleness and considering whatever previous digital harm someone might have experienced and trying not to like force people to relive it. So if you need to take a break, feel free to, and remember that this live is being recorded.
Thank you, Olivia. My name is Ingrid. I use she, her pronouns, and so today we were going to talk about platform surveillance. And there's, in general, what we're kind of focused on is both ways that platforms surveil and forms of state surveillance that utilize platforms. Should we go to the next slide? So this is sort of an outline of where we're going today. First, kind of doing a little bit of clarifying some terms that we're going to use. Those two different kind of terms being state surveillance and surveillance capitalism. And then we'll talk a little bit about mitigation strategies with both. So clarifying some terms, just there's a way, we wanted to kind of make sure we're clear about what we were talking about. So surveillance capitalism is a term used to describe sort of a system of capitalism reliant on the monetization of personal data, generally collected from people doing things online. A state surveillance is not itself surveillance capitalism. It's a term to describe a tactic used by governments to intimidate and attack. State surveillance can be digital. It can also be IRL. For many years, it was just people following people or decoding paper messages. It's more sophisticated now, but it takes many different forms. And surveillance capitalism kind of emerges in part because of the demands of state surveillance. So in the early 2000s, after 9/11, the existence of a military industrial complex that had funded the development of surveillance technologies was already well established, but was amped up in some ways by the demands of the global war on terror. And there are, deep interconnections between the history of Silicon Valley and the history of the military industrial complex. But, and the state utilizes the resources of surveillance capitalism, but we wanted to make it clear, like, surveillance capitalism's negative impacts and risks to personal safety are not solely confined to state violence. They can perpetuate interpersonal violence. They can, create greater harms for your ability to kind of find a place to live, or change your mobility. And those are, those two distinctions we just kind of wanted to clarify as we go into this. And I feel like part of me wants to believe this is kind of already taken as a given, but it's good to kind of have it said. Neither surveillance capitalism nor state surveillance exist independent of racism and the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. Sometimes I found when I first started getting into this space in 2012, 2013, that was kind of an angle that was kind of neglected. But you don't have an industrial revolution without transatlantic slave trade, and you don't have surveillance without the need to monitor people who are considered other or property, basically. I would highly recommend Simone Brown's Dark Matters as an introduction into the role of Blackness in the history of surveillance. But yeah, we just wanted to raise that up, also to be really honest about who is affected by these systems the most. And also wanted to reiterate something that we said in the first day of this series, which is, nothing is completely secure, and that's okay. We're learning how to manage risk instead, right? The only way to be completely safe on the internet is to not be on the internet. Connection is, involves vulnerability by default. And the work that we're trying to all do is find ways to create space, to mitigate or understand the risks that we're taking in, rather than just assuming everything's a threat and closing off, or saying, well, I'm doomed anyway, doesn't matter. In the world of security studies, or in learning about building a security, a way of thinking about keeping yourself safe, a term that comes from that space is threat modeling, which is a practice of basically assessing your potential vulnerabilities with regard to surveillance. We're not going to be doing threat modeling per se in this presentation. There's some really great resources out there that exist on how to do that we're happy to point you to. But we wanted to raise it up as something that can help you to approach managing risk and mitigation, because it's about sort of inventorying your own circumstances and understanding where you are and aren't at risk, which can make it a little less overwhelming. All right, so the concept of state surveillance, for this presentation, we're going to be talking about it on and using platforms, which we talked about yesterday. There's all kinds of other ways that, as I said earlier, that the state can engage in surveillance. we're right this second just going to focus on platforms. We might be, if there are questions specifically about non-platform things, maybe in the Q&A part, we could talk about those if there's time. So platforms are companies. I think we've said this a lot over the last 3 days. And what that generally means is that platforms have to and will comply with requests from law enforcement for user data. They don't have to tell anyone that that happens. They do. Some of the companies, some big companies do. These are is from, the one on the top is Twitter's annual transparency report, and the one below is Facebook's. And these are just graphs that they're visualizations they made about government requests for user data. But again, like this is almost a courtesy. This is like, and something that's kind of done maybe for the brand, not necessarily because they have any obligation. But it's also just a reminder, like they can't actually necessarily say no to like a warrant. This also applies to internet service providers like Verizon, mobile data providers, hosting services. Like companies have to do what the law tells them, and most of the internet is run by companies. Next slide. So companies don't actually, but governments don't really always have to ask platforms to share like private data if there's sort of enough publicly available material to draw from. The method of sort of using publicly accessible data from online sources is sometimes called open source investigations, in that the method is reproducible and the data is publicly available. When Backpage still existed, that was more or less how cops would use it to conduct raids. One older example of this is in 2014, the New York Police Department conducted a massive raid on public housing project in Harlem to arrest suspected gang members. It was called, had like some terrible name, Operation Crew Cut, that's what it was called. And much of the evidence used in the raid was culled basically from cops lurking on social media, interpreting slang and inside jokes between teenage boys as gang coordination. Some of the young men, I think they were as young as 16 and as old as 23, who were caught in that raid are still serving sentences. Some of them were able to challenge the case and be let out, but they still kind of, endured a pretty terrible process. A more recent example of sort of police using publicly available data is this one on the left. In June. This woman in this photo was charged with allegedly setting a Philadelphia police vehicle on fire. And the police were able to figure out who she was based on a tattoo visible in the photo, which you can't really see in this image because it's quite small. I couldn't get a bigger one. Based on the t-shirt she was wearing, which she had bought from an Etsy store, and previous amateur modeling work she had done for freelance photographers on Instagram. So piecing together images of her and purchases she made that only a handful of people maybe had bought that one Etsy shirt, they were able to, and they were able to kind of figure out, match her to these other images online that were just out in the public. I want to note briefly just that open source investigation or digital investigation using publicly available resources isn't inherently like a bad thing or technique. Like it's research. Investigative journalists use it to expose misinformation campaigns, and human rights activists use it to verify information around war crimes when it's not safe for them to be on the ground. I've used it in my own work, but the point of bringing it up is, don't make it easier for police to do their job. Yes, our next slide is another source of information that can be pulled from publicly available sites, besides just sort of reading the material in the images, is metadata. And metadata is sort of just a fancy word for data about data. If one way that sometimes this gets described is like, if you have like a piece of physical mail, the letter is sort of like the data, but who it's the envelope, so who it's mailed to, where it was mailed from, things like that, that's the metadata. It's like the container that has sort of like the relevant information about the content. So in an image, it's encoded into the file with information about the photo. This is some screenshots of a photo of my dog on my phone. She briefly interrupted the session yesterday, so I thought I'd let her be a guest in today's presentation. And if I scroll down on my phone and look kind of further below in the Android interface, I can see that it has the day and the time that the photo was taken. And then what I've blocked out with that big blue square right there is a Google Maps embed that has a map of exactly where I took the picture. And oh no, you can see the latitude and longitude in one of those images, OPSEC fail. Now you all know where I live. Don't be like me. You can also see what kind of phone I used to take this picture. You can see where the image is stored in my folder. You can see how big the image file is. These are examples of like metadata that combined with things like actual information in the data, like the actual information in the image, like a t-shirt or a tattoo. All of that is like really useful for law enforcement. And metadata is something that is stored. If you use like Instagram's API to access photos, you can get metadata like this from the app.
So surveillance capitalism, really big. Oh, there's a Q&A. Is it possible to remove metadata from your phone's camera?
So there's two things that you can do. One is, I think that you can in your settings, like you can disable location being stored on the photos, depending, I think, on the make and model. Another thing, if you're concerned about the detailed metadata and you want to you can taking a screenshot of the image on your phone is not going to store the location that the screenshot was taken. It's not going to store I think that the screenshot data might store like what kind of device the screenshot was taken on, but that doesn't necessarily narrow it down in a world of mostly iPhones and Samsung devices and Android devices, and like it could be it's like a bit less granular. Yeah.
Awesome. So surveillance capitalism. I don't know if you guys notice, I've been seeing them a lot more often. But some advertisements in between YouTube videos are just kind of like multiple choice questions. Some of them ask how old you are. Some of them might ask if you've graduated from school yet, etc. So like, in what world is a single question survey a replacement for, say, a 30-second advertisement for Old Spice deodorant? Our world, specifically our world under surveillance capitalism. So to go further on Ingrid's initial definition, surveillance capitalism occurs when our data is the commodity for sale on the market. And usually, almost always created and captured through companies who provide free online services like Facebook, Google, YouTube, etc. We can't really know for sure how much our data is worth. There's no industry standard. Because at the end of the day, information that's viable for one company could be completely useless for another company. But we do know that Facebook makes about $30 every quarter off of each individual user. But social media sites aren't the only ones with business models designed around selling information. We also have data brokers. And data brokers, if we go back to the private investigator example that we saw in the state surveillance section, thinking about the tools at their disposal, the level of openness that you have online, they could find out a lot of things about you, like where you've lived, your habits, what you spend money on, who your family members and romantic partners are, what your political alignment is, your health status, etc. And that's like one person. But imagine if rather than searching through your data and piecing together a story themselves. They actually just had access to a giant vacuum cleaner and were able to hoover up the entire internet instead. That is kind of what a data broker is. I made up this like tiny case study for Exact Data. They're a data broker and they're in Chicago. And Exact Data has profiles of about 240 million individuals. And they have about 700 elements associated with each of them. So some of the questions that you could answer if you looked at a stranger's profile through Exact Data would be their name, their address, their ethnicity, their level of education, if they have grandkids or not, if they like woodworking. So it goes from like really basic facts about you to like your interests and what you spend your time on. And so potential for harm. You get lumped in algorithmically with a group, belief, or other demographic when you would prefer to be anonymous. Your profile might appear in algorithmic recommendations because of traits about yourself that you normally would like to keep private. The advertisements you see might be reminders of previous habits that might be triggering for you to see now. And it's also, of course, a gateway for local authorities to obtain extremely detailed information about you. I don't know if Ingrid has any other points that might be potentials for harm. But luckily, there are ways to mitigate, right? You can opt out of this, even though it's pretty hard. But if you remember from our first workshop where we talked about how websites collect data from us, we know that it's captured mostly using scripts, trackers, cookies, etc. So you can use a script blocker. Also, reading the terms of service, it will probably mention the type of data an online service collects and what it's for. They don't always, but a lot of them do. So if you read it, you're able to have a bit more agency over whether you agree to use that service or not. And you might be able to look for alternatives that have different terms of service. Privacy laws in the United States are pretty relaxed when it comes to forcing companies to report things. So one tip is also to try setting your VPN location to a country that has stronger privacy laws. And then you might get a lot more banners about cookies and other trackers that they're required to tell you if you live somewhere else that's not here. You can also contact data brokers and ask to be put on their internal suppression list. And a lot of brokers have forms you can fill out online requesting that. But the only issue is that this is really hard because there are a lot of data broker companies and we don't actually know how many more there are because this is an industry that's pretty unregulated. Another mitigation strategy is creating essentially a digital alter ego that's difficult to trace to your other online accounts. So if you are behaving in a way that you don't want to be conflated algorithmically with the rest of your life, you can create separate online profiles using different email addresses, potentially using them in other places, and just creating as much distance between you in one aspect of your life and you in the other aspect of your life, and compartmentalizing in a way that makes it difficult to connect the two of you. And then, of course, you can use encrypted apps that don't store metadata or actual data. This could include messaging apps, but this could also include word processors like CryptPad. It could include like video conferencing. It could include a lot of different apps. So to wrap everything up, over the past 3 days.
Sorry. Yeah, so, oh gosh, we went through these so fast. I thought this was going to be a much more longer presentation. So I guess we wanted to kind of try and provide some wrap up because we covered a lot of things in 3 days. And that was like a very broad version of a very like deep and complicated subject. But we sort of, we went through, the foundational kind of depths of the internet, how it's, made, what it's like, the actual kind of like technical aspects of how it works, the platforms that are built atop that foundation that extract value out of it, and systems of power that incentivize those platforms to exist and control and govern kind of how some of that value is used or misused. And I guess across all three of these, I had a couple of like kind of bigger questions or things to think about that I wanted to kind of put forward. One is sort of like, I think in some ways, the neoliberal public-private structure of the internet as an infrastructure that everyone lives with, it shapes the way that like everything else kind of follows, right? When something that was originally sort of like a government-built property becomes a commodity that becomes the foundation of how anyone kind of can like live in the world, it creates kind of a lot of these after effects. And I think I find internet history always really fascinating because it's a reminder that a lot of this is very contingent and it could have gone different ways. Sometimes people wanted it to go a different way, and thinking about what it looks like to build different networks, build different services and structures. And while living within surveillance capitalism, because we haven't built different internets and different structures quite yet, our surveillance capitalism is still pretty big. A big part of taking care of one another and ourselves is taking care with where and how we speak and act online. Which is different from being afraid to say things and more being kind of confident in where and how you like choose to speak to protect yourself and to protect people you care about. I think that went by really fast.
We'll just shower you with questions. I have 2 questions in the chat. Someone says, how is it exactly that companies make money off of our data? Is it just through ads? Are there other processes?
So when it comes to making money off of it, sometimes, let's say you're a company that sells, headphones, and you are tracking data of the people who are using your headphones. They buy them, and then in order to use them, they have to download an app into their phone, right? Through that app, they might record things like the songs you listen to, what time of day you listen to them, how long you're using the app, where you are when you're listening to it. And they might have this like select like little package of data about you. Now, they might find that that's data that like a music campaign, the people who like do advertisement for musicians, I guess. I don't remember what that job's called, but it's more like the idea that different companies collect data that's useful for other companies in their marketing practices or in their business practices. So Facebook collects data that a lot of different companies might want for a myriad of reasons, because the amount of data Facebook kind of siphons from people is so large. And so, yeah, do any of you guys have something to say around that, about other ways that companies might be able to sell data?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it bottoms out in like ads and market research.
Yeah.
Another place where I don't think it's not the most lucrative source of revenue, I think, as far as it's not the biggest buyer, but like police departments will buy from data brokers. There's no real regulation on whether or when they do that. So it's just information in general is valuable. So it's not like, I think and ironically, I think what's kind of so fascinating to me about the model of surveillance capitalism is that like ads don't work, or like they kind of work, but like they don't. in terms in terms of actually proving that like after I look at a pair of glasses once and then I'm followed around on the internet by the same pair of glasses for like 2.5 months, like the actual success rate that I actually bought the glasses, I don't think is that high. But there is just enough faith in the idea of it that it continues to make lots and lots of money. It's like very speculative.
I actually saw an article recently that said instead of advertise, like say like we all paid for like an ad-free internet, it would cost about like $35 a month for each of us. In terms of like being able to maintain like internet infrastructure and pay for things without having advertisements. If you have an alter ego account and a personal account, how do you ensure your online accounts stay completely compartmentalized and are associated through your device or IP address, etc.? And then they say, is there a way to protect your face from being collected on facial recognition if you post pictures on both accounts?
Yeah, so we didn't talk about facial recognition, and I kind of falsely assumed that it's been so heavily talked about in the news that maybe it was sort of a thing that people were kind of not over, but I also didn't want to overemphasize that as a risk because there's so much other information beyond a face that can be used when trying to identify people. In terms of if you're posting pictures on 2 different accounts, I don't like. I mean, if they're similar photos, I don't think I think the answer is like your face will be captured no matter like what. That's sort of a piece of it. I don't know, Olivia, can you think of any examples of like mitigation of face recognition beyond like, I mean, Dazzle doesn't really work anymore, but like in the same way that like people will avoid copyright like bots catching them on YouTube by like changing the like cropping or like subtly like altering like a video file.
I just dropped a link. Have you seen this? It's from the SAN lab in Chicago called the Fox tool, and it like slightly alters the pixels so that it's unrecognizable to facial recognition technologies. I'm still sort of looking into it, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about when we're thinking about uploading photos to like escort ads or something like that.
I think that's difficult when it comes to like facial recognition is because depending on like who the other actor is, they have access to like a different level of technology. Like the consumer facing facial recognition software, like the stuff that's in Instagram face filters and like the stuff that's on your photo booth app on your laptop. It's really different from the kinds of tools that like say the state would have at their disposal. So it's kind of like a different, I don't know if the word threat model is even a good way to phrase it, because we know that like say for instance the New York Police Department definitely has tools that allow them to identify pictures of protesters with just their eyes and their eyebrows. And so normally, if I were talking to someone who has like 2 different accounts and is interested in not like being connected to both of those accounts because of their biometric data, like their face, I would normally suggest that they like wear like a mask that covers their whole face, honestly, because I don't really know of a foolproof way to avoid it digitally without like actively like destroying the file. Like you'd have to put like an emoji, like you'd have to physically cover your face in a way that doesn't that's irreversible for someone else who downloads the photo to do. Because there's a lot of tricks online when it comes to like changing the lighting and like putting glitter on your face and doing a lot of different stuff. And some of those work on consumer facing facial recognition technology, but we don't actually know if that even works at the state level, if that makes sense. So depending on like who you're worried about tracking your account, you might just want to straight up cover your face or leave your face out of photos.
I wonder too, if you could talk a little bit about gait analysis and how that's also used. Are you familiar with that?
I don't know enough about gait analysis.
I know that it exists.
Yeah, and I think like and this is another thing where in trying to figure out what to talk about for this session, figuring out like what are things that where we actually know where the risks are, and what are things that may exist but we like can't necessarily like identify where they are.
I've heard of resources for people who are interested, like for high-risk people who are worried about being found via gait analysis. And your gait analysis is literally being identified by the way that you walk and like the way that you move. And there are resources of people who like teach workshops about like how to like mess with your like walk in a way that makes you not recognizable, and how to like practice doing that.
That's fascinating.
If you use popular platforms like Facebook and Instagram in browsers instead of apps, does that give you a little more control over your data, or does it not really matter? So Olivia and Glenn, if you have other thoughts on this, please jump in. I mean, my position is it kind of doesn't matter insofar as what the things that Facebook like stores about you are things you do on Facebook. Like it's still tied to an account, and unless you're talking, and so I don't think so. It's kind of whether it's like ultimately like it's not just like passive kind of like trackers are happening that you could maybe use a script blocker on, and that's cool, but like things you like and things you click on Facebook in the browser are still going to be stored in a database like as attached to your profile. So it doesn't necessarily change I think the concerns over both of those, but
I'm not told. I have also heard things about having the Facebook app on your phone that it gives Facebook access to more things, like the terms of service are different. I'm not totally sure about it. I don't have it on
that's
my phone.
a good point. I apologize. I should I guess it depends on what thing you're trying to kind of concerned about. So one way that one thing that Facebook really likes having information on for users, individual users, is who else they might want to be Facebook friends with, right? The like people you may know feature I once read is like uses up like a very large percentage of like the Facebook like infrastructure compute, because connecting people to other people is really, really hard. And like the Facebook app being on your phone does give it kind of the opportunity to be opened up to your phone contacts and places you take your phone, which can expand like the network of people that it thinks might be like in your proximity or in your social network. Because if a phone number in your phone has a Facebook account, maybe they'll say like, oh, like you know this person probably. In 2017, Kashmir Hill and Surya Matu did a series of articles for Gizmodo, sort of investigating the people you may know feature to try and understand how it worked. That was inspired by Cash getting recommended a friend on Facebook that was a long lost relative that like from her like father's previous marriage or something, that there was like no way they would have otherwise met. And so her interest partly came out of trying to figure out how they could have possibly even made those connections. And Facebook wouldn't tell them, because the people you know feature is also like a very powerful like tool that makes them like an app that people want to use in theory. They also did some follow-up stories about sex workers being like outed on their alt apps because on their like alt accounts because the people you may know feature was recommending friends who knew the sex worker from like other parts of their life, the alt account. And there also were examples of like therapists and like mental health professionals being recommended people who were clients as Facebook friends, people who met other people in like, 12-step meetings being recommended as Facebook friends. So there, in terms of like app versus browser, like Facebook won't say whether or not some of this stuff goes into, whether or not information that it gathers from like mobile devices goes into its people you may know recommendations. But based anecdotally on examples like this, it seems likely that plays a role. So that can, it doesn't, I guess, in terms of control over your data, like maybe I think I misunderstood the framing of the question, because I guess it's more, it gives you slightly more control over what Facebook does and doesn't know about you. Because if Facebook doesn't know about what you're doing with and on your phone, that's probably like not a bad idea. Did that all make sense, or was that, I don't know.
No, I think that made sense. Someone was asking about the Facebook Messenger app. I think the same thing sort of applies to that because it's all connected. I don't know if anyone has anything else to say about that.
This is the part where I admit that I'm not on Facebook. So I'm actually terrible at answering a lot of Facebook questions because I don't in fact use it.
Also, I think it's, oh, sorry, Olivia, go ahead.
No, I also haven't opened Facebook since like 2014.
Yeah, I also think like Instagram is owned by Facebook. So also having the Instagram app on your phone, I feel like might also bring up some of the same concerns.
Yeah, I think it's slightly from what I mean, I do use Instagram, so I can remember that interface slightly better, but like my experience, like, so as far as I've been able, like, so like as my point of comparison, I had sort of like a dummy like lurker Facebook account for some research a while ago. And the difference between its attempts to like connect me and suggest follows versus Instagram's attempts were like, Facebook was like, seemed far more aggressive, and given far less information about me, was able to draw connections that like didn't make any sense, that like were very accurate. So I think that's just a good thing. Like it's don't trust Instagram because don't trust Facebook. But in my experience, like I don't know if it's as much a part, like it's not as central to the business models.
Yeah, and I think too, like just speaking from my own personal experience, like when I have had Facebook or Instagram, I use like a tertiary alias and lock the account and don't use a face photo on the app, just so if it does recommend me to a client, they're much less likely to know that it's me. And like that has happened on my Instagram account, so my personal Instagram account.
Yeah. There are several follow-ups, but I feel like this question, can you explain about Palantir, has been sitting for a while, so I want to make sure it gets answered and then go back to the to this part.
I can explain a little bit about Palantir. So Palantir is kind of the devil. We have, I think it's existed since like 2014. That might be the wrong, no, not 20, something that's, I think it was 2004 actually.
Yeah, no, it's 2004. I accidentally like stumbled into a Wall Street Journal article about them in 2009 yesterday while researching something else, and like died a little inside because it was really, everybody's like, this company's great. I can't see how any of this will become problematic.
It's 2003, yeah, 17 years.
It was started by Peter Thiel, who is a really strong Trump supporter, and is linked to this really weird like anti-democracy, pro-monarchy movement in Silicon Valley that's like held by a lot of like a weird circle of rich people. And they are kind of the pioneers of predictive policing. And have also like assisted ICE with tracking down and deporting immigrants. And they actually recently went public.
They
Hmm?
did? Wow.
Yeah, they haven't like turned a profit yet in 17 years. But it was initially funded, if I'm getting this right, I'm pretty sure they're initially funded by like the venture capital arm of the CIA.
Okay, they haven't gone public yet, but they are planning for an IPO
Soon. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, just because a thing about this company is that every 2 years there is a flurry of press about them maybe doing an IPO, and then they don't. And so I mean, sorry, their initial funding partially came from InQtel, which is a capital firm run by the CIA that funds companies that make products that the CIA might need. Keyhole, which was a satellite imagery software company, was initially funded by the CIA, and that company was later acquired by Google and became Google Earth. So just as an example of the kinds of other things that they fund, it's stuff like that. I think.
And to clarify, it's like a data mining company. So they do the same kind of thing that that the case study that I showed earlier does, but they're really good at it, and they also create tools and technologies to do more of it.
Yeah, well,
and they're funded by sorry, go on.
So, and they're kind of a good example of the point made at the beginning of this about surveillance capitalism and state surveillance being closely intertwined. Palantir has corporate and government contracts to do data mining services. They work with, I think they were working with like Nestle for a while, and Coca-Cola. They as much want to be providing the same tools to businesses as they do to ICE. And those kinds of services are seen as sort of interchangeable. I mean, the funny thing to me about Palantir too is that it's not they're, in some ways I feel like it's I'm not even sure they're the best at what they do. It's that they're the best at getting contracts and making people think that they're cool at what they do.
They think of themselves as a software company, but they really just kind of have a lot of files.
They're kind of, somebody in the tech industry once described them to me as the McKinsey of data mining. McKinsey is a consulting firm that they work with lots of governments and corporations to do things that seem to just make everything worse, but they keep making money. This is the best way to describe it. So I think in terms of explaining about Palantir, I guess they are a high profile example of the kind of company that is rampant throughout the tech industry. They have the most cartoonish accoutrement insofar as, one of their founders is literally a vampire. And they're, they took money from the CIA, and their name comes from a Lord of the Rings, magical seeing stone. In some ways, I think that there is a level, they have, there have been documented instances of them doing egregious things, such as working with the city of New Orleans Police Department to develop predictive policing tools without an actual contract. So without any oversight from the city council, without any oversight from the mayor's office, based on, and basically through the funding for the project coming through a private foundation. But in terms of did you personally in your day-to-day life worry about this specific company any more than you would worry about a specific state agency? I don't I think it's going to depend on your particular risk levels, but they're a tool of the state, but not necessarily themselves going to come for people.
Also,
read a vampire question.
Literally a vampire. Peter Thiel is one of those people who believes in getting infusions of young people's blood to stay healthy and young. So as far as I'm concerned, a vampire.
I also just wanted to talk briefly about Thorn and Spotlight, because I think that, Spotlight is a tool used by Thorn, which I believe Ashton Kutcher is a co-founder of. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Thorn, but the mission of Thorn is to, air quotes, stop human trafficking. And what they do is they use their technology to scrape escort ads and create databases of facial recognition built off of those ads. And so I think it's just interesting to think about the relationship between these tools and how they collaborate with the police and with ICE, and in a way that could potentially facilitate the deportation of migrant sex workers as well.
Okay, sorry, let's, yes, Ashton, fuck him. So one question here, deleting the Facebook or Insta app won't help, right? Because the info on you has already been collected. Not necessarily. I mean, there won't be any more data collected. And I think it's true that it won't be erased unless you delete your account and like go through the steps to like actually delete it, because they'll trick you and be like, just deactivate it. You can always come back. Never come back. But yeah, I mean, there's if it's something that, like, you know, as you continue to live your life and go places, although I guess people are going to go places right now, they won't have any more material. Yeah.
Someone asked if you have an existing Facebook account that have civilian photos, but you haven't touched for updated in 4 years, it only has those data points. So I think that's like sort of like a follow-up to the previous question.
Yeah, that's true. The material, well, that's mostly true, but like there's also like people you know who have Facebook accounts. And like the Facebook has this internal mechanism for like tracking non-Facebook users as like air quote like users, or as like entities that they can serve ads to. And generally it's based on like those people being like tagged in other people's images, even if they don't like have an account, or if they have a dead account. Like if you have like a 4-year-old untouched Facebook account and somebody tags a contemporary photo of you, like those data points are connected. So, you know, whatever other people do that could connect to or back to that original account, or whatever, like, yeah, whatever followers or friends you have on it, updates that they produce could kind of be new data points about you. In terms of fintech, how easy is it for company to link your pay app accounts to social accounts? Blunt, you might have a more comprehensive answer on this than I will.
Okay, let me take a look. So I think that there are like databases built off of escort ads that then get shared on the back end to sort of facilitate like a network type effect of deplatforming sex workers. So a lot of people report, and some of the research that we're doing sort of confirms this, that once you experience like deplatforming or shadow banning on one platform, you're significantly more likely to experience it or lose access to it on another. So as like a form of harm reduction and being able to keep access to those financial technologies, I suggest just having like a burner email account that you only use for that, that's not listed anywhere else publicly, that sounds like vanilla and civilian. So that way that if they're like if they're scraping email addresses from escort ads and then selling that data to financial technologies, that your email won't be in there. And it's just like adding one layer of protection. It might be connected in some other ways, but to sort of as a form of harm reduction. I don't know if that answered that question. And I'm looking right now for resources specifically on protecting community members in regards to ICE entering trans sex workers. I know that Red Canary Song does some work around this, specifically with migrant massage parlor workers, and I'm looking up the name of the organization of trans Latinx sex workers in Jackson Heights. So I will drop that link so you can follow their work as well. And please feel free to drop any other questions in the chat, even if it wasn't covered. We'll see if we can answer them. And this is your time, so feel free to ask away.
What tech update journals or websites do we follow to stay up to date? Oh, I wanna know more about what other people do too. I tend to follow specific writers more than specific outlets, partly because like there are freelancers who like kind of go to different places, but also like I value kind of seeing like people who've like developed expertise in things. So Julia Carey Wong at The Guardian is someone who I read a lot. Melissa Garrett Grant at The New Republic is not always writing about tech, often writing about many other things, but probably one of the like smartest and sharpest and most integrity-filled writers I know.
Definitely one of the first to cover FOSTA SESTA for sure.
Yeah. And I've been, let's see, what are other good Motherboard in general, Jason Kobler and Janice Rose are very well sourced in the industry. So I usually trust things that they cover and find. Carolyn Haskins is a young reporter who used to be at Motherboard and is now at BuzzFeed, who does really excellent work along with Ryan Mack. And Kashmir Hill is now at the New York Times, but she has also written for Gizmodo and Forbes. And anyone else? Davy Elba recently moved to the Times and was at BuzzFeed and is also really great. Those are mine. Yeah.
I sign up for the it's like Casey Newton's daily email letter, and I just sort of read that to stay up to date on certain tech news and then research more. I know that the Internet Freedom Festival also has good updates, and I'm also happy to drop links to other like weekly mailing lists that I sign up to as well.
Well, I was muted. Oops. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I know the like Mozilla IRL podcast was really good for me in terms of like learning more about like the internet and specifically like surveillance infrastructure. And they have a lot of episodes. So if you're like idling and you have time to listen rather than reading, Mozilla also has their transcripts out, which is pretty nice.
Is there any way for bookmarks on my browser to be accessed? I believe the answer for that is going to depend on the browser, because, or it can depend on the browser. So I think in the case of a browser like Chrome, which is owned by Google, if you are like logged into your Google account as part of like your browser using, I think all of that information then gets associated with your Google account. So Google will have that data. In terms of access beyond that, I'm not sure. And then I think for other browsers, I don't believe that that would be something that's stored on Firefox. I'm not sure about Microsoft Edge. Elodie, do you have any other thoughts on that one?
I don't know.
Talking about safety of Zoom. Okay, yeah, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, I think. Zoom is, you know, it's software that was made for like workplace calls and is designed for that setting, which means in some ways like it is inherently a workplace surveillance tool. It is relatively like, I mean, it's not secure in the sense that like these, I mean, first of all, this is being like recorded, and can, you know, Zoom calls can be broadcast to live streams like this one is, but also the, you know, communications, like the actual calls aren't, you know, encrypted in any way. Like they kind of can just be like logged onto if they're public. If you kind of just do like some URL hacking. There are, you know, different settings you can make in terms of letting people in or out of meetings, but at the end of the day, also like, you know, Zoom has access to the calls, and how much you trust Zoom with that material is, you know, at your discretion. I mean, in general, like when it comes to like Zoom calls are not where I would discuss like sensitive topics or anything I wouldn't want to have on the record. And that's generally just the protocol I take with it. And I think, I mean, that being said, like, yeah, there are, it is in such common use at this point in terms of like spaces for events like this one, that I won't like kind of outright boycott it simply because it's become such a ubiquitous tool. But I think compartmentalizing what I do and don't use it for has been helpful.
And so if you're interested in staying up to date with Earn It, I would suggest following Hacking Hustling and Kate Diadamo. I can drop their handle also. And on July 21st at 7 p.m., Hacking Hustling will be hosting with our legal team a legal literacy webinar that's sort of similar to this, answering space to answer questions, and we'll be providing more information as to like where Earn It is and how you can sort of plug in on that.
Is there government regulation of data tracking or not so much? Not so much, yes. In the United States, there's very little regulation. So the reason, one of the reasons that, or the reason that if you use a VPN and set it to a place like Switzerland, you get a lot more information about, you know, what tracking is happening, and you can, you know, make requests for data from platforms, is because of a European Union regulation called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, or maybe General Data Privacy Regulations, sorry. And yeah, the United States does not have an equivalent to that. Some websites, in some ways, like because the European Union is such a large market, I have seen some companies kind of just unilaterally become GDPR compliant for like all users, simply because it's like easier than having like a GDPR version and a like other places version. But you know, when it comes to Facebook or like Instagram or like large platforms, there's like they don't really have an incentive to like create conditions where they collect less data. So I think there it's kind of like, well, sorry, it's gonna be that way. Yeah. And it's not as, and I think it is a thing that like lawmakers have interest in, but I think part of the challenge is both like these companies are, you know, very well funded and will like seek to and will like lobby against further regulation. And also like a lot of people in Congress are old and bad at computer and don't necessarily sometimes have trouble, I think, wrapping their heads around some of the concepts underlying this. And, you know, are not necessarily, and like, I think the general atmosphere and attitude around like free markets solve problems kind of further undermines pursuit of regulation. In terms of social media accounts following your activity, based on your research, so for shadow banning, etc., who do you follow and to certain lists? I think Glenn, this question might be for you because of the research.
Yeah, I think it's less about who you follow and more about who you interact with. So it's like we're still analyzing this research, but there seems to be a trend that like if you're shadow banned, the people that you know are more likely to be shadow banned, and there might be some relationship between the way that you interact on the platform, but we're still figuring that out. But just like one thing you can try, and we talked about this in another one, but having a backup account for promo tweets, so your primary account with the most followers doesn't exhibit quote unquote bot-like activity of automated tweets, and just having like casual conversation about cheese or nature. We're not totally sure how it works. And also I believe her name is Amber. I'm going to drop a link to it, but someone is doing a training on shadow banning, and it seems like we're collecting data on like multiple accounts, and it seems like there's some interesting things to say. So I'm going to go grab a link to that if you're interested in learning more on shadow banning. That's on the 25th at like 5 p.m. I think. So I'll drop a link. And just for the live stream, so this is with Amberly Rothfield, and it's called Shadow Banning Algorithms Explained, July 25th at 6 p.m. online. There are still a few spots left. And it looks like she was pulling social media transcripts for weeks and months of data on different accounts and playing with the different accounts and analyzing the posts' interaction and traction. So that should be really interesting too. Cool. Thank you so much for all of the amazing questions. I think we'll give it a few more minutes for any other questions that folks have or any other resources we can maybe connect people with, and then we'll log off. Someone's asking, can I request my information from data mining companies?
Yes, you can.
Yes, you can. And a lot of them, let me see if I can find a link, because a lot of them have like forms either on their websites or available where you can make requests like that. You can request to see it, and I'm pretty sure you can also, I know you can request that they stopped collecting it and that they get rid of your file, but I think you can also request to see it.
I also just dropped a link to this. This is an old tool that I'm not sure if it still works, but it's Helen Niesenbaum's Ad Nauseam, which is both an ad blocker that works by clicking on every single advertisement, as well as it creates like a data visualization of all of the targeted ads towards you. And it's incredibly overwhelming to see. Like I remember looking at it once and I could just like track when I was taking what class in school, like when I was going through a breakup just based on my searches and my targeted ads. Cool. So is there anything else you want to say before we log off?
I mean, thank you all so much for participating. Thank you again, Corey, for doing the transcription. And yeah, yeah, this has been really great.
Great. Thanks so much. And it sounds like we'll be providing a list of resources in a follow-up email or on our Twitter. So you can follow us at Hacking Hustling to stay tuned for more events like this. Thanks so much.